Welcome, everybody. This lecture is entitled What's in a Hive? And essentially, what we want to get out of this lecture is I'm trying to give you an understanding of what you're going to see inside of a beehive, both in the brood chamber and in the honey supers. And so we're just going to go through exactly what you can expect to see, what it looks like, what these things are that you're going to be seeing in there. And so this is going to familiarize yourself with the inside of a beehive. This lecture is in preparation for our hive inspection lecture. So we need to know what's in the hive before we can start inspecting for things. So that's what this is going to cover. All right, so your responsibility as a beekeeper is that really you have to be able to identify, recognize, understand, and react to situations that you're going to be encountering in a beehive. And really what you need to understand is that all of this is something that is very critical to the survival of your honeybees. If you can't identify the sexes of your bees, that's a problem because now you're going to have difficulty telling the difference between a drone and a worker or even a queen. You have to recognize the situations that are dangerous if you get into them. So if you can't recognize that you're in a queenless situation, for example, you're going to get yourself into a situation where the colony is just going to decline, maybe abscond completely, but it's not going to survive and be healthy. You have to be able to understand what you're looking at. So you are going to be in situations where you're going to be forced with critical thinking. It's one of the things I love about beekeeping is it's a constant practice in critical thinking. And you have to be able to understand what you're looking at in order to make educated decisions on management. And then finally, you need to be able to react. Once you understand what you're looking at, once you've recognized it and identified it, you have to be able to react in a way that is suitable for the conditions that you see. So, for example, if you have a high mite count, your reaction is that you need to do some sort of a treatment to stave off those mites or to help control them or manage them within the hive. So this is all very important for you as you get started in beekeeping. There's really no beginner level to beekeeping. In order to be successful and get bees to winter well, you have to be very well educated. And that's why taking courses like this are so important. And just to kind of contextualize this, bees are something that we often are not used to working. Growing up, most of us are not working insects. And, bees are really the only insect that we keep as livestock. And so unless you grew up with a beekeeper in your life or in a beekeeping family, the likelihood that you've interacted with bees is very remote. But again, your responsibility as a beekeeper is you've got to educate yourself to be able to tell what is what. In a situation like this, if you had someone that said wanted to become a hog farmer and they couldn't tell the difference between a male and a female hog, that's going to be pretty darn problematic, right? If you can't tell something as basic as who's a male and who's a female, how are you going to be able to manage this livestock in any meaningful way? Because you don't even know the basics. And the same goes for beekeeping. Again, you have to know these critical things. The same thing would go along for, say, a cattle rancher who doesn't know what the pests or pathogens are that affect cattle. And what that does is that essentially, if you don't even know what you're facing when they come up and when problems arise from pests and pathogens, you have no idea what you're seeing and you have no idea how to react. And it's the same thing with beekeeping. So just like all other areas of livestock, your responsibility as the farmer is to help contribute to the health and well-being of your livestock because you're managing them. It's not just some feral animal out in the wild. So that's something important to understand. And like I said a little bit earlier, there is no beginner level to hive knowledge. You as a beekeeper are going to be faced with these decisions every single time you interact with your bees, and you have to be well educated to know what you're seeing, how to react, be able to understand what you're looking at, those types of things. And all of your decisions, all of your management decisions, the success of your colony is all going to be based on your knowledge or lack thereof. So if you don't take the knowledge piece of becoming a beekeeper seriously, the educational piece, you're not going to succeed. I'll be real honest with you. Keeping bees in northern Michigan and the UP is hard, a lot harder than other places that I've lived. And what you need to understand is that if you are not educated, if you don't really understand the organism, this is just going to be a fight all the time to get bees to survive. And although it's fun keeping bees during the season, if they don't survive the winter, this hobby just becomes very expensive. So education is key, and making sure you're getting education that's relevant to your place, to your environment is important as well. And there's actually been research that's been done that shows that education is actually one of the major drivers of survival of honeybees. There was a study that was done a few years back that was in the scientific journal PLOS One that looked at basically how does education match up with disease and pest control with beekeepers. And what they found, the major findings were that hobbyist beekeepers with small apiaries and little experience in beekeeping had double the winter mortality rate when compared to professional beekeepers. Furthermore, honeybees kept by professional beekeepers never showed signs of disease, unlike apiaries from hobbyist beekeepers that had symptoms of bacterial infection and heavy varroa infestation. Our data highlight beekeeper background and apicultural practices as major drivers of honeybee colony losses. So right there, it tells you education is the key to success. Now, I know that things like colony collapse disorder have been in the media and they've gotten a lot of attention, and it seems like that all the bees are dying. And the reality of that is that, yes, colony collapse disorder it kind of came up, and we really aren't seeing it as much anymore. And so we're still trying to figure out what colony collapse disorder actually was or is in that context. But for the vast majority of beekeepers, when you are doing beekeeping as a career, a professional beekeeper, your losses are substantially lower than hobbyist beekeepers. And that is true time and time again. I've seen it in my entire career. Normally, hobbyist beekeepers have very high losses mainly because they don't understand how to work with pests and pathogens, and they have a very little understanding of the actual biology of overwintering. And that's something that's really important. Bees in a box is one thing, but understanding how to manage those bees over a winter period is a really key factor to survival. So education is the key. All right, so then let's dive into our hive bodies and see what exactly is in there so that you can become educated on what you're going to see in this bee colony as you get into it. So we're going to start with the brood chamber. That's where the business is really happening. That's where all of your bees are being laid, your young bees by your queen. And so it's really important to understand this delineation between brood chambers and honey supers. And you can see highlighted here, the brood chambers are generally going to be your bottom boxes. And when you think of them in size, okay, when you're actually thinking of how big this chamber is going to be size-wise, essentially it covers about 2 deeps is generally what the actual brood chamber will cover, or 3 mediums, depending on what size hive equipment you're using for your brood chamber. Now, when you want to try to visualize this as far as size, I generally tell people if you were to stack 2 basketballs on top of one another, that's about the size of your brood chamber. And it's essentially the center of all creation in your beehive. It's where all the businesses happen as far as raising young bees. So we're located in the bottom portion of the hive, about 2 boxes deep as far as deep boxes, or 3 mediums worth of space. Let's go in and actually see how the hive is oriented on the inside of the brood chamber. So this is looking down on our brood chamber, and you can see that this is an 8-frame beehive. So if you have a 10-frame beehive, it's going to be about the same. You'll just have a little bit extra in here. But essentially what you're going to be looking at when you're looking down into a brood chamber is that there is a set orientation that bees always create when it comes to a brood chamber. And the reason for this is that resources are placed in specific areas to feed bees. And so let's see how this is put together. So in your middle of your brood chamber is where your brood is going to be laid. It's where eggs are going to be laid, it's where the larva is reared, and it's where your bees pupate and become adult bees. And so the center of your brood chamber is where all of that activity is happening. Now, the reason that it's in the center, one, is for thermal regulation. So when you do get kind of cold nights or something like that, the bees cluster around the brood and keep it warm. The brood has to stay at a little over 90 degrees all the time, or it will chill and die. And so that's why it's all right there in the center. So for example, if you were to be working a brood chamber and say you forget where a frame has gone, you do not want to break up this middle part of this chamber, because if you start creating space or putting frames where they don't belong, you can create issues where they cannot thermoregulate that entire brood chamber, and you may end up getting brood frames that actually chill out and the bees just die in them. as they're being raised. So it's important as you're working beehives to also make sure that you're maintaining the same order in the frames as you take them out. Both the order that they're in the box and the direction that they're facing is very important. So make sure you're always monitoring that as you're taking frames out. But that is all of your brood is going to be right there in the middle. Now, immediately around your brood is going to be food, and it's primarily pollen. Pollen is going to be facing inside. So pollen, if we're looking here at these pollen/honey frames, they store both on these frames, but you're essentially going to see most of that pollen facing inside to the brood. And the reason for that is pollen is the protein that they feed young bees, and your bees need to be able to very quickly get that pollen and move it right into the nursery where they're feeding young bees. And so pollen is always right next to the brood. So again, if you get confused when you're putting things back together, you forgot where a frame went, this is the order that frames generally go in. And so if you have a pollen frame, you know that that's going to be the frame right on the outside of your brood. Now, the frame that's on the far outside of the boxes is your honey frame. And if you have a 10 frame equipment, you may have a couple of these on each side, or you may have a little bit of expansion in the middle of the brood chamber. Maybe you have 5 frames of brood, something like that. But that is generally going to be where they store honey, is on the far outside. And those are going to be generally pure honey frames for the most part. So that's how your brood chamber is going to be oriented. This is always the orientation of a beehive. This is always the way that they orient. Now, the brood could shift a little bit, frame over or frame back, depending on drawn frames and all sorts of other factors, but this is the general orientation that you're going to see things in as you're working a colony. Now let's take a look at what the frames are that we see inside of this brood chamber. This is going to be the brood frames, and this is what a kind of classic brood frame looks like. You can see that the elements that we're looking at here are the inside here where all of these cappings are. This is our brood. That's our bees that have been capped and are going to be hatching here in the next week or so. Right outside of that brood, you see this band of uncapped materials that are kind of like, they look like pollen colors, right? They look like colors of pollen, and that's what that is. That's the pollen band. And generally in a classic brood frame arrangement, you're going to have your brood, and then you're going to have a band of pollen right around that. Now, my old mentor in California used to call that the power band. The bigger band of pollen you have around that brood chamber, the more access those bees are going to have to feeding young bees. So it's just right there for them to get to. Now, immediately around that, you see in these corners this capped stuff that looks like it's kind of curly cappings. That's honey. Now let's take a little bit closer look at that, because there's a very easy way to see the difference between some of these capped resources that we see inside of beehives. And some people get confused on capped brood and capped honey. And so I'm going to show you exactly how to tell the difference here. So here we're looking at a close-up of that same photo. You can see our pollen right here in the middle of our capped brood and our capped honey. The way you can tell the difference between capped brood and capped honey, very simple. Look at they obviously look different, right? They look a little bit different, but maybe as you're getting in your beehive and these aren't right next to each other, maybe you can't kind of conceptualize what these look like in your head. But here's how you tell the difference. Cappings on brood are laid down one at a time. So as the brood matures based on the days it's alive, then it gets capped, and it gets capped by itself. And so when you look at this brood cappings here, you can actually see the outlines of each individual cell in that brood chamber. And so that is how you tell that this is brood, because each of the cappings are put on one at a time. So the cells are identifiable by looking at the capped brood. When we look at the honey up here in the corner, you can see that there is no delineation between the actual cells. And in fact, when honey is capped, it's capped in sheets. They don't actually cap individual cells. They just lay down a whole sheet as they're going across and capping honey that's cured out. So when you're looking at honey, it's never going to be individual cells. It's always going to be kind of this curly, undefinable cappings. But this brood is always going to be a definable capping that is capped with the cell fully identifiable when looking at it. So you can easily see that there are individual cells here. So that's how you tell the difference between capped honey and capped brood when you're looking at a brood chamber. Now, just to show you a little bit more of this, we oftentimes will see mixed frames. So not always will you have a frame that's totally capped. Sometimes you're going to have a mixture of uncapped and capped brood. And so you want to be able to identify what is uncapped brood. Uncapped brood is young brood. It's brood that's in the larval stage and the egg stage. Once the larval stage matures and turns in a prepupal stage, that's when the capping goes on. And the pupal stage is essentially like other insects, where, like a butterfly, for example, the pupal stage is essentially where that caterpillar turns into a totally different looking insect, which is our butterfly. The same thing goes for bees. They go from this larval shape, this kind of worm-like organism, all the way to this bee, which looks very different than the larva. And so that's complete metamorphosis that we're talking about. But what you see here is, in this picture, you can see our honeys right here at the top, our pollen, and then you see this open brood here. And you can see that the open brood is white that's down in those cells. Now, when we get into our hive inspections lecture, I'm going to talk to you about how to define what is healthy brood and what is unhealthy brood. But what I want you to get into your mind at this point is that healthy brood is always going to be this bright white color. If there's any other color associated with brood, it means that there's something wrong with it. It means that there is some sort of a disease that has been introduced into the larva. And so that's something to note. But you can see in all of these uncapped cells, well, you can see the real bright white ones. Those are ones that are just about ready to be capped. They grow very, very large in these cells. And then you can see these over here to the left. These are young larvae. They're barely kind of in this small C shape. And so that's kind of what we're going to be looking at as far as when we're looking in the brood chamber, is we're trying to identify, one, that we have capped brood, but also that we have uncapped brood. And then we're also going to want to see that we have eggs as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in our inspection lecture. All right, so honey and bee bread. So this is kind of a little more detail oriented on those actual resources that are on the brood frame. So honey and bee bread. Let's talk about honey first because it's the easiest. Like I said, honey, those wax sheets go down in sheets. And so although you can see right here that they're just starting to cap these, right? And they're kind of all doing these all at one time. And so they're kind of coming off in sheets. And you can see some definable cells, but for the most part, you got mostly ripples on this. So that is capped honey. Now, honey is the product that bees store and utilize as food, particularly during winter. Honey is the resource that they use to thermoregulate. So the caloric intake that they get from honey allows them to burn those calories and actually create heat in the winter. So honey is directly related to winter survival. And honey is also this really fascinating thing, because when honey comes in from nature, from flowers, it has a really high water content, usually like 40 to 80% water content by volume in that nectar. And honey is what it is honey is actually a cured down version of nectar. And so basically when nectar comes in, it's broken down into simple sugars, fructose and glucose, by enzymes that the bees have in their body. It's basically in their salivary glands is where these enzymes reside. And what happens is that complex sugar that comes in the form of nectar is broken down into these simple sugars, stored, and then the water content is drawn down over time. And what happens is that high water content of nectar over time is drawn down to 18% or below water content. At that point, that is when honey is capped. And when honey is capped at that water content, honey will last forever. It may crystallize. That's a natural aging process of honey, but it is edible in perpetuity, meaning that those ancient Egyptians that we talked about in our first lecture, basically that story of being able to find vessels of honey in ancient tombs in Egypt and that honey still being edible, this is why, is because it's cured down to a point where it does not ferment. If it's above 18% water content, it will ferment and those sugars will turn into alcohol. And that's, your honey will essentially smell like alcohol. And that is also the process that we use for making mead as well. So not a bad process, but it is a process in which your honey will not be stored as honey in perpetuity, but rather will convert to alcohol over time. So 18% is what the bees are looking for when they're going to get that honey capped, so that honey can be stored and utilized when they need it. Pollen is the other resource that we see in those frames. Now, pollen comes in with a very high moisture content, and it'll mold really quickly if it's not preserved. So what bees do when they bring this in is that they combine it with digestive fluids, particularly lactic acid bacteria, and that bacteria metabolizes the sugars in the pollen, and it produces this lactic acid, which lowers the pH of the pollen and basically makes it very acidic. And so at that acidic level, that's pretty much the threshold. Once it hits this really acidic level, it's usually below a 4.5 pH, and at that level, it's very difficult for microbes to grow on that medium. So it kind of inhibits microbial growth, and so at that point, it's pretty much sealed with some honey to prevent air from getting into the pollen, and basically is a fermented food at that point, and is used to feed young bees. So although pollen comes in, and we oftentimes think that bees are just feeding them pollen, they're actually converting that pollen through a fermentation process. And once that's complete, that's what we call bee bread. And this is what you see when you look at a cross section of a pollen cell, is you can see that it's all these pollen grains that are put together to make up that pollen resource. And that's all, again, fermented and then capped, so that air can't get in to cause degradation or a decomposition of that material, or introduction of microbes for that matter. Okay, also in the brood chamber, you're going to see all of your castes and sexes of bees. And so I just wanted to cover this again real quick as we're getting into this idea of what we're going to be seeing in the bee colony. Let's start with the worker real quick. And remember, you're going to be able to identify these by sight. That's your responsibility, and part of your education is to be able to understand how you can identify these by sight. So, worker bees, most numerous bees in the colony. They are also the smallest bees in the colony. And the ways that you can tell a worker from other bees is pretty simple. One, again, it's the most numerous and the smallest, but rather you can also see, and we've talked about this in past lectures, is the head. The head is a really important place to look when you're trying to determine the sex of bees, because worker bees and female bees in general, including the queen, do not have very large eyes. They have these eyes that are pretty much isolated to the sides of the head. And they also have a tapered abdomen that comes to a point, and that point is where the stinger resides. So those are two very easy characteristics that you can use to identify a worker bee. Now, when we look at this in comparison to a male bee, a drone bee, from head on, you can see very different look, right? Not only is the drone bee much larger than the worker bee, but you have these massive eyes that cover the head. And the drones are the only ones that have these eyes. So if you see huge eyes on an insect in a honeybee colony, it's a drone. And it is a very easy way to tell who is a drone and who is not. The other thing you can see in this drone in flight is that the rear end, the abdomen portion of this, it has kind of a blunt end to it, and it's furry. That is also because this insect does not have a stinger. It has an ediegus, or a penis, is what what you may know that vernacular as. So this is actually an organ, a section of this honeybee that is not going to sting you. So when we're handling bees, and I've talked about this, I think in the past, is that you can safely handle drones and not worry about getting stung. So say, for example, you want to practice marking queens. Drones are a great choice for that, because you can handle those bees and you're not going to get stung. So because they don't have a stinger. Now, finally, we also have a queen. The queen is kind of the center of the hive. She lays all of the young in the hive, up to 2,000 eggs a day. She is the workforce that creates all of the bees that contribute to the longevity and productivity of a hive. So she is really important. Now, there is a color-coded international system that we use for identifying the age of queen bees. Queen bees can live multiple years, and so we need to be able to monitor how old these queens are over time. And so we use actually an international marking system where we mark the backs, or the back of the thorax of queens in certain colors during certain years. So for example, this is the international code right here that we have listed on the right. You can see that years that end in 1 or 6 are white, years that end in 2 or 7 are yellow, years that end in 3 or 8 are red, 4 and 9 are green, 5 and 0 are blue. And so that's an easy way to keep track of the age of your bees. Now, it may not sound like a big deal if you only have a couple colonies, but if you have colonies that live year after year after year, it can sometimes get confusing how old your queen is, or maybe you've had a supersedure that you didn't know about. And so if you go back to a hive and all of a sudden you don't have a marked queen, you know something happened. There, obviously the queen's been replaced or you had a swarm. So it is a very helpful tool. It also really aids in finding queens when you're looking in a very full box of bees. So it also is a nice way to be able to see them much easier. But those are the sexes that you're going to see and the casts that you're going to see inside of the brood chamber. Now, the one thing that I want to leave you with as we're talking about this is we're going to have to be able to see certain aspects as well. And I talked about the eggs and larvae a little earlier. Let's actually look at those eggs. So eggs are something that you have to be able to see in a bee colony. And if you've got to take time and train yourself or get a magnifying glass or a flashlight or whatever tool you need to be able to see these in the bottom of these cells, you have to do that. You have to be able to see eggs. And the reason is because when these colonies get large, you are not going to find your queen in every inspection. And the only way you can tell if you're queen right, meaning that a queen is present and laying, is if you see eggs. And the reason that that's valuable is because if you remember back from your biology lectures, eggs last for 3 days before they hatch. And so what that means is that if you see eggs in a colony that you're inspecting, it means that there was a queen there in the last 3 days, which means that you can essentially say you have a laying queen. Eggs are always located in the bottom of the cells. They stand upright. They're kind of like a very, very small grain of rice. But you have got to be able to see these. And it is difficult. It's not an easy process. But one of the tricks that you can use is when you're looking in your frames, have the sun coming over your shoulder and going right down into those cells. So you might have to move it a little bit. But that's how you see eggs, is getting that sun to beat right down into those cells. Again, you may need a flashlight. You may need to use a magnifying glass, whatever works for you. If you wear glasses like myself, make sure you're wearing your glasses when you're beekeeping. So you need to be able to see these things. The other thing that you're going to see is larvae, and that's the white stuff that's in these cells that look like these worms. And we saw this in an earlier picture, but you can see a much closer up here. So when it comes to larvae, remember from your biology lecture that there's multiple stages, and we call these stages of the larva instars, and there's 5 instars associated with bees. So they go through multiple levels of growth in the larval stage, and that's what you see in this frame here. You can also see eggs. There's eggs right there, but you can see here that there's multiple instar stages in this frame. And you see that we have essentially, like, this is a 4th instar where we've got almost the full cell cleared out. This is a 5th instar where you can see that this larva is essentially almost completely filled out this cell. And then we get down into the younger instar stages, like 3rd, 2nd, 1st, or this is probably 1st here. But you see that there's a progression here of size. Now, when you're looking down in these frames and you're evaluating these as you're going through them, the things that you're looking for are color and shape. So you can see that these are seated in the bottom of the cell. If your larva is laying flat in the cell, that's something's wrong then. This is how these larvae are always going to look, is this kind of C shape in the bottom of a cell. The other thing that you can see in some of these other pictures is there's a little bit of a liquid substance down in there with them. That is food that they're being fed. So they're always in a pool of food as well. So that is what you can expect to see in those brood frames that are not capped, is this situation right here. Now, when it comes to cappings, there are 2 types of cappings. Now, we talked about that cappings are put down individually on each cell, and that is still the case here in both of these situations on this frame. But you can see that these are 2 different styles of capping. One is the workers that we see on the right here, and one is drones. Now, you can see visually that these look very different. The thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these cells is that workers are smaller bees, so they need smaller cells. And so the cappings are usually kind of flush with the comb. You can see that the drones have these domed cappings on them. It's because they're bigger bees and they need more space. So those like Cocoa Puff tops, that is drone cells. So that you can delineate between the 2 of these very easily just because of the size of the bee. So you know that a drone's bigger. it's going to be in a bigger cell. And so that's how you determine the difference between the two of these. You may also see queen cells in your brood chamber, and this is what a queen cell looks like. It's always facing down. The reason that they're facing down is queen cells are sensitive to gravity, actually. And if you actually flip a frame over that has a queen cell on it and leave it sitting, you will kill the queen. So gravity actually plays a role in queen cells, which is why they always face down. They're much longer than regular cells. They don't stick out straight from the comb like our other two cells, the drone cells and the worker cells. They actually come out of the comb and point down. And so that's something really important to see. And they're much larger because the queen is much larger. Now, one thing that people really get confused about is this idea of, do I actually have a queen cell? And there are two different situations. There are queen cups and queen cells. Now, a queen cup is what you see here on the left. A queen cup is just a normal thing that bees build in order to get ready for a queen if they need one. You will see queen cups all the time. They mean nothing to you unless there is an egg in them. And if there is an egg in them, that's when that queen cup becomes a queen cell and you are actually having a queen raised. The queen cups are always in your colonies. They mean absolutely nothing as far as swarming or queen replacement. They are just in the colony as something that they build in case they need a queen. Now, a queen cell is like what we see in the picture on the right. This is a capped queen cell, but you will see that queen cells will get longer over time as they're building out the queen and feeding her, and she's getting bigger. So, what I want you to take from this is that queen cups are normal. Queen cells mean that you have a situation going on, meaning that there is either going to be a swarm or supersedure happening in your colony, or maybe you have an emergency situation where they're raising an emergency queen because a queen was lost for some reason. So that's the difference between these two. Don't get crazy about queen cups. They're a normal part of a beehive. All right, so that's the bulk of the lecture right there, is the brood chamber, because that's where all the business is happening. So let's take a look at the honey super, which is much easier. The honey supers are located above your brood chamber, and this is the natural orientation that bees store honey. They always put brood below, and honey is stored directly above the brood. This is, excuse me, this is why sometimes people have problems with overwintering colonies in northern climates that are not oriented in this fashion, but rather are oriented in horizontal fashion. So like a long hive that some of you may have heard of, like basically top bar hives, or long laying hives is what we call them. These long hives do not have food oriented above the cluster. And the reason that above the cluster is so important is because think about it as a tree. You know, bees naturally nest in trees. Their trees are long, tubular, vertically facing organisms, and that is the natural orientation. So they're storing brood or food above. And what happens with that food is over the course of the winter, the colony clusters down in the bottom boxes when it starts the winter, and then over the course of the winter, it moves up with gravity. Bees are sensitive to gravity, and so they move up in this fashion because that's how they naturally store food, and they feed on those honey reserves and basically keep temperature regulated by feeding on those reserves. By the end of the season, that cluster's moved all the way up to the top of your box, and so the honey needs to be above the brood chamber, and that is why these other styles of hives don't work well in northern climates. If you live in the southern part of the United States, a long hive works just fine because you have very short winters. You don't need tons of resources above. Here, you need 100 to 150 pounds of honey, meaning you need at least 2 to 3 honey supers above your brood chamber by the end of the season so that there's plenty of food to eat, and it has to be above. So that's where the honey super comes in. Now, when we go inside of this honey super, this is also where you're going to be harvesting honey from. So you need to be able to understand when you should be harvesting honey and what you're looking at, right? So as we talked about, honey has to be drawn down in water content before it is stable for storage. You always want to be harvesting capped honey, and you're going to see in the honey super capped and uncapped honey, and that's what you see on this picture. See, the top is capped, the bottom is uncapped. The thing I want to leave you with on this is when you are harvesting honey, you only harvest capped honey. If you harvest uncapped honey, you run the risk of having a high water content and that honey fermenting on you. You don't want that to happen, and the last thing you want to have is if you sold that honey is a customer opens that bottle and smells alcohol. That means that that honey is actually not honey. It is still basically nectar at that point. So you want to make sure you're harvesting what's right. But being able to determine the difference between uncapped and capped honey, pretty darn simple, right? Well, let's take just one last look at the difference between capped and honey and capped brood. Again, when we look at honey, it's laid down in sheets. You can kind of see some cells in here, but for the most part, they're unidentifiable. Rather, when we look at the capped brood, you can see that these individual cells are clearly identifiable. So it should be very easy to see the difference between the two. Now, if you're not using a queen excluder, meaning you're not keeping her down in the bottom boxes, you may get a queen that wanders up into some of your honey supers and lays a little bit of brood in there. And so you may see a little bit of brood sometimes in your honey supers if you don't run a queen excluder. And that's a personal choice. I don't run queen excluders. Many people do. But those essentially just sequester those bees to the queen to the bottom brood boxes. And I'd say to recall your equipment lecture on that, because we talk a little bit about the functionality of queen excluders. Now, what you will see, and this is just kind of wrap up what you're going to see in that honey super, you may see two different types of cappings on honey. And this is, I get a lot of calls on this for some reason. People get very concerned as to why their cappings look different. So there's two styles of cappings that bees put down. We call them either dry cappings or wet cappings. And you can see on the left, this is what's considered a dry capping. On the left or on the right is what's considered a wet capping. The difference between the two is that the dry cappings, certain lines of bees, just by preference in their evolution, like to keep an air gap underneath the cappings. And so they actually cap before the cell is completely full, which creates an air gap, which is what gives you that opaque color on the left, on the dry picture. So there's actually an air gap underneath there. Wet cappings mean that the bees have laid the capping right down on the honey. So on the right picture, that honey is actually in contact with the wax cappings. And so it gives you more of this translucent look than with the dry cappings. Now, Italian bees, this is just an example, just a rough example. Italian bees tend to produce dry cappings. It's just something that they do by nature. Conversely, Caucasian bees tend to do wet cappings. And then we have all of these other bees that are basically different lineages, all of these different origins as far as where they're from. And some of these may have one or the other, and some hives do both. So it's just it makes no difference for you as a beekeeper. It's just the way that bees are storing honey. So wet versus dry cappings really doesn't matter to you as a beekeeper, but it is something that you will see. But as far as harvesting, it makes no difference. It's all good honey. So this is what you can expect to see in your beehives as you're getting ready to go into them. Basic areas, your brood chamber, your honey super, and what you're going to find in between all of them. So get familiar with this material, get familiar with what you're going to be seeing so that when you do look at it in a colony, you can readily identify it. And getting ready for your inspections, that's going to be really critical as you being able to identify these things. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and we'll see you at the next one.